Welcome in this 20-minute Socratic dialogue, in which I will interview Mark Blaisse, and after that Mark Blaisse will do a Socratic interview with me. I'd like to start to introduce Mark Blaisse to the audience. Mark Blaisse is has many aspects in his professional life. He was a journalist, he was a consultant, and he was a writer, and he is still a writer. Also, he did a lot of consultancy in all over the world, in Africa or United States or Asia and Europe. And he wrote a lot about the European concept. So I like to have some questions to put forward, and I will, before I do that, I will just show two books which are very relevant for this Socratic interview: The Concept of Europe and the book about the Saudis, which will be, of course, a very pregnant issue the coming years to come. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
I want to start with an open question. What is the dream of Europe seen from the outside of Europe? In general.
In general, it all depends, of course, which outside. For some continents, Europe is very far away. Let's say Africa. For some continents, Europe is a dream of the past, where they came from. For instance, Australia and the United States. And then you have, of course, you have the periphery of Europe itself, where the optimism and the hope and the dreams are lots jollier than they are inside of the EU, because we have to make a difference between the concept of Europe and, of course, the European Union with its 26 members. From outside, I think they are idealizing the whole idea of how beautiful, how warm, how friendly, and how high the solidarity is inside of Europe. Of course, we inside know better.
Okay, so you say that there are different perspectives depending on the location of where you are in the globe. We have, of course, the African is different than the Asian, and there are some parts of the world which are descendants of Europe, and there are parts of the world who are looking towards a dream and idealizing some aspects of the European culture, while we inside know that this is not the real truth. Can you elaborate on that? So what is the dream they idealize about Europe?
Of course, those who founded Europe, the French and the Germans, they came out of a war, and before that another war. And Europe has been haunted by wars, actually, always. And their dream was, can we create a Europe that avoids wars? And I think in that matter they succeeded, because ever since the Second World War, there has not been much of a war, at least not inside the European Union. Let's forget for this moment the war in former Yugoslavia, of course. So that part of the dream was realized. Then, of course, peace is one thing, but prosperity is another thing. And part of the dream was we will all be happy and working and healthy and well educated, and we will stick together and show the world that we are an example of morale, of ethics, of taste. And that, of course, did not succeed, because we found out that nationalism and pride, local pride, seem to be more important than European solidarity. It's very difficult for most members of the European Union to actually forget that they are Italian or Spanish or Dutch, for that matter, and to really stick together when it comes to really big decisions. Then I think of an army, a European army, or a European all sorts of other systems that did not work. Some, of course, did work, and we have the euro, not to everybody's happiness, but it really helps. So part of the dream is realized, and part of the dream is actually evaporating.
Yes, so the dream that is realized, then you talk about a lot of years, decennia without war after bloody history. So that's a very important point to go into. And the other point is that the dream of Europe is also about taste, about morality, about ideals. And then you say these ideals are not realized. And then you say because nationalism has dominated the common solidarity. And you see that, for instance, in the lack of an army or the lack of firm positions in also matters of world affair.
Well,
Can you elaborate on the first one? So Europe has stopped having fights and war.
Well, that speaks for itself, I would say. The generations of our parents who have witnessed the war, they have realized that this should never happen again. What we should hope is that the next generations, my children, for instance, understand that Europe is not growing on a tree, that they are Europe, they are the people of Europe who have to stick together and create an atmosphere, create a trust amongst each other that will avoid a next war. And as we look at the world today, there's a lot of threat coming from everywhere. There's a rather strange authority in the United States that is turning its back to Europe. There's a lot of tension in the Middle East, turning its back to Europe, probably looking at America, probably looking at China and at Russia. The powers that are coming towards us are far from democratic. So Europe will have to decide whether there will be one union defending democracy all over the world, or that they will be just engulfed by power plays from totally different political systems.
So basically you say, okay, there are no wars anymore, but the threat is evident, is present, because of all different political powers around us, and maybe also the lack of initiative of the Europeans to defend their democracy. Is that correct?
Well, if you look at a couple of countries member of the European Union, let's take, for example, Hungary and Austria. They have far-right governments now that use a kind of European way of thinking to say we have to stay pure European, which leads to xenophobia, and which leads to racism, and which leads to anti-democratic attitude towards foreigners. So that's not very hopeful. Europe that used to be known for its hospitality. Indeed, the Greek society where we, in a way, originated with our democracy was a very hospitable society. And it's a shame that Europe is not much more open to migrants. As we know, Europe has been created by migrants coming from one part of Europe to the other part, moving due to religious conflicts. And I think we should really rethink the narrative of Europe adapted to the situation in the 21st century.
Okay. You say, you name Austria as an example where this dream is in danger because of internal upcoming nationalism. Even you call it xenophobia and racism, which is against the spirit, the dream of Europe, you say, because that's always been the history of Europe, the hospitality, starting with the root of Europe in Greece, in Athens. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, it's really the essential part of the European culture and the European history. Is of course has started in Greece, where they understood that pure tyranny doesn't make people happy, that democracy in the old Greek fashion, of course, not comparable to ours, was the beginning of individual freedom, individual creativity, individual thinking, the beginning of equal rights for most people in those days, and through the Enlightenment in France and through all sorts of important anti-autocratic revolutions in Europe, we arrived at where we are now. And we are supposed to be the example for the world of an open society, tolerant society, equal rights for men, women, and everyone. And instead of being an example, we are fighting with each other. We are, we are creating tensions about all sorts of problems that are rooted in our primary ideals.
Mm-hmm. So you say that democracy is a very important aspect of the European dream. It was the history. It survived a lot of internal conflicts. We had gained this democracy through revolutions. Instead of being the strong example of democratic values, we are internally dividing ourselves because we are quarreling about all sorts of dangers which jeopardize our concept. Can you give an example or an explanation why, for instance, Austria or Hungary are now falling in this quarrel and this inclination of xenophobia?
As a child, I used to live in Austria, so I know quite a lot about that country. And in the book you just mentioned, I have a chapter on the Austrian identity. It's one of the countries inside the European Union that is still struggling with its own identity. If you can't look in the mirror of your own history, if you can't look at your own past in an open way, and you are hiding uncomfortable truths, then it's very difficult to find a position inside any common society, and certainly inside the EU. And when Austrians are by nature not very friendly to foreigners, Hungarians neither. They used to have a combi state called the Austrian Hungarian Empire and Kingdom. And in both countries there is a kind of negative attitude to anything foreign, anything colored, anything different. Austria is a very Catholic country. They don't like others in many ways. They are suspicious of anything non-Austrian. And now comes a government with a very young Prime Minister, Sebastian Kurz, who promises his people that he will protect them from mingling with other cultures, with other races, that he will protect them from migrants, that he will actually, in a way, close the borders, while the rest of Europe is looking at each other and saying, we have to do something about these migrants because we can't leave them at sea. We can't leave them in camps. We have to divide, the amount of people, migrants, over the members. And Austria won't do, and Hungary won't do. And that's not a good signal to the rest of the world. We must never forget that all of Africa, maybe with the exception of South Africa, and all of Asia, with a few exceptions, maybe India and so on, there is no democracy. So, and don't forget China, don't forget Russia. So we have to stick together, become the example, show the world what humanitarian attitude is, how we should, be brothers instead of enemies.
So you basically stress two important points: is that we have to deepen our democratic practice in facing of the world around us, which is falling into authoritative structures. That's the first thing. So we don't have to fight in between us within the EU. And you gave us an sort of explanation of the problems in Austria because they're trying to evade facing their identity, their history. You said
yes.
they are not willing to recognize their past. And that's why they are so, maybe that would be a reason you said that they are against everything which is alien to them. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it must be very difficult to live in a country and to be in a country where the truth is hidden, where excuses are found for collaboration, for joining the Germans in the war, for playing a game that they, were probably pulled into without being able to defend themselves. And their attitude in Austria is, let's forget about it, let's not talk about it, let's look at the future. But deep down, they have an identity problem, and it's very difficult to go into a party if you are insecure about yourself. What attitude would you choose? What would you wear? How would you walk? So there is a kind of natural insecurity which makes them, a difficult partner. Let's put it that way.
Okay, clear. That's more. Let's try to, in the last part, find what could be the real identity, because we talk about identity. What could be the European identity?
The European identity is actually part of the dream we talked about before. It would be wonderful if all Europeans would agree on what makes a European European. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we shouldn't have too big a dream. But part of the identity must be, in my opinion, democracy, freedom of speech, everything connected to human rights, creativity, philosophy, intelligence. Don't forget music, just thoughts, the thought about mankind, the books about who we are, what we do, why we do it. All this most of it originated in Europe, and we should be proud of that, and we should keep on doing it. And in fact, for the past decennia, we gave it up a little bit. We thought, well, Europe, it's done, it's made, it's okay, and we are protected by the United States of America, and now everything's changing, and I think there is a necessity, an urgent necessity, to stick together and to create a stronger, more self-secure, independent, intelligent, humane Europe.
So you mentioned a lot of values like democracy, freedom of speech, human rights are essentials for the European identity. And then you mentioned all sorts of elements like creativity in aesthetical way, music, art, literature, and so on. And you stressed that a lot of these creations is born in Europe, and that's our Europe identity. But then you said we've lost this self-confidence somewhere in this and thought USA is better, or we have also, of course, Silicon Valley power. But we have to continue this. Can you say something about this? How can we stress this and these beautiful values in a narrative?
Well, you see, I try to explain to my children why Europe is so important for them and for their children. And it's not enough to say we created peace because it could be a coincidence. So I think it's important to travel and to look into other more authoritarian countries, see what's going wrong there, and realizing the benefits of being born in Europe and living in Europe, and create a narrative that you show to pupils in an early age, not when there's in university, but maybe even in primary school. Europe culture, Europe history, should be part of the curriculum of schools, so that they understand that Europe is much more than bureaucracy, taxes, freedom of traveling. It's much more than that. It's much deeper, and it should become part of the DNA of every young European in order to save Europe for the future.
Yes. And how did we do in the Saudi case? Can you say?
That's an interesting example, because everybody knows that Saudi Arabia is involved in a war in Yemen, which we all condemn. Saudi Arabia is involved in murdering a journalist who was criticizing the regime. Saudi Arabia is involved in many things we don't like, and at the same time, business is going on as usual. And instead of making a European fist and saying, guys, we will stop every deal and every business with Saudi Arabia until they change their way of working, we keep on selling arms for a war we condemn, and only 1 or 2 countries within Europe have decided to be courageous and to say no and to lose millions, maybe even billions, and where greed does not beat morale.
So you say that's very important, that we keep up our values, although it will give us some negative consequences in the economy. That's very European. Can you in the future?
Well, I think if greed beats morale, where are we with our European example? Then we are, in fact, giving the green light to whitewashing, to dictatorship, to lies, to cover-ups, to muzzling the free press. Everything which is European is going down the drain if we treat countries like Saudi Arabia as we do now.
Okay.
This was the occasion to show solidarity. And what did we do? Fill our pockets.
Thank you for this interview.
Thank you.